We need on-site renewable energy, high efficiency, and all-electric homes everywhere in order to have a safe, just transition.
There are going to be incredible opportunities for workers in this new energy economy.
That environmental justice is also about communities being able to take charge of their own infrastructure.
In February 2023, the U.S. Department of Energy released the Draft National Transmission Needs Study, which describes the current state and needs of the U.S. transmission grid. The draft study states that areas with high electricity costs, like the Midwest, will benefit from new transmission that delivers cost-effective wind energy from the Great Plains. The report also projects that regional demand, extreme weather, and large-scale solar and wind deployment will require that the Midwest make significant transmission investments by 2030. The most striking projection from the report is that to meet the goal of a 70% decarbonized grid by 2030, the Midwest will need to double our transmission capacity, putting us at the top of the list for regional transmission needs in the United States. A significant portion of the federal Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, signed into law in November 2021, supports new transmission construction. The law creates a new transmission facilitation program to provide technical support for new projects, $50 million in direct funding, and a $2.5 billion revolving loan program to leverage private investment. It also changes transmission siting authority, giving FERC authority over siting decisions on projects deemed of national interest, allowing them to overrule state siting decisions if necessary. Utility companies in Minnesota have announced $2.2 billion in transmission investments in the coming years. Wisconsin utilities also plan $2.2 billion in transmission projects. And the board of the Midwest Independent System Operator, MISO, approved a $10.3 billion portfolio of 18 Upper Midwest transmission projects in July 2022, with projects to come online as early as 2028. The lines are expected to support 53 gigawatts of large-scale wind and solar projects. Study after study shows that to meet grid decarbonization goals, we need a significant amount of new large-scale renewable projects. And to deploy the wind and solar farms needed, we need transmission. A recent Wisconsin study, which we will talk about in detail in a later episode with Chelsea Chandler from Clean Wisconsin, shows that interstate transmission projects will decrease electricity costs by decreasing the need for in-state wind, solar, and energy storage expansion by 18%. In this scenario, to meet Wisconsin's goal of 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050, we will need between 240 and 285,000 acres of solar alone, representing nearly 2% of Wisconsin's agricultural land. A brief review of newspaper articles concerning proposed large-scale solar installations in the Midwest reveals a significant amount of local opposition. In Tazewell County, Illinois, Columbia County, Wisconsin, Livingston County, Michigan, Defiance County, Ohio, and more, local opposition is already slowing or canceling planned solar projects. This despite the very real economic benefits to local landowners and the townships and counties where the projects are sited. For example, the 300 megawatt High Noon solar farm in Columbia County, Wisconsin will provide nearly $700,000 per year to the county and $500,000 per year to the township under the revenue sharing formula in the state's utility aid fund. That is significant support for school, police, fire, roads, and more. With such significant financial and environmental benefits, what is driving the opposition? According to researchers at Michigan State University who interviewed residents living in communities where 4 projects were proposed in Michigan, they found what they call a solar social gap between where projects enjoyed broad support and where there was significant opposition, according to the authors. While wind and solar energy projects have their own unique factors that contribute to a social gap, such as wildlife concerns for wind and agricultural land conversion concerns for solar, they also share one common driver: poor decision-making processes. Our research found that solar social gaps form primarily due to top-down decision-making methods that fail to incorporate citizen input and transparent communication. Their recommendation? Meaningful and upfront decision-making strategies can make a difference in community acceptance of large-scale solar projects. Government officials and solar developers have a responsibility to actively involve citizens in solar project siting to improve the development process, better accommodate for local values, and close the solar social gap. In the meantime, counties across the Midwest have been working to restrict local solar energy development, and the state of Illinois, following legislation adopted in California and New York, passed uniform siting rules for solar and wind projects that supersede local ability to pass stricter rules. Groups are suing to stop transmission projects. Cost projections for transmission projects are rising. Regulators are debating whether to allow competitive bidding for projects to control costs. And researchers are demonstrating the very real benefits of solar development to growing corn for ethanol. Consider these two shocking findings. Solar has over 100 times the energy return on investment than corn ethanol on a per acre basis. And looking at Wisconsin, if we replaced just 1/3 of the land used to grow corn for ethanol with solar, we could meet the state's 100% carbon-free electricity goal. Summing the benefits: local economic development, farm-sustaining revenue, land use efficiency, environmental conservation, and job creation, rural renewable energy development seems to be a classic win-win scenario. Yet, many don't seem to see it that way and have very real concerns about aesthetics, neighboring property values, and their lack of control in the decision-making process. To discuss the opportunities and challenges in large-scale wind, solar, and transmission development in Midwest states, we talked with Peter Mavis, who has been working with the Clean Grid Alliance to advance rural renewable energy development in the Midwest and Plains states.
Join Nick and Peter at the Energy Fair. Early bird pricing for admission to the 2023 Energy Fair ends on May 15th. Head to theenergyfair.org/tickets to grab your discounted admission. MREA members get into the fair for free. Visit midwestrenew.org/membership to learn more.
We are joined today by Peter Mavis. He is the Regional Policy Manager at the Clean Grid Alliance. Before his work with Clean Grid, he worked in the Minnesota State Senate. He served as caucus researcher for Transportation and Public Safety Finance and Policy Committee, as well as the Energy and Utilities Finance and Policy Committee. And he spent time serving as the administrator for the Energy, Utilities, and Telecommunications Committee. Peter manages for Clean Grid Alliance Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, North and South Dakota. And you work with the legislative process, energy and utility law, and with all political parties. Thank you so much for joining us today, Peter. How you doing?
Good, Nick. Thanks for having me. Things are going good. We're right in the middle of legislative session, so things are busy.
Yeah, we appreciate you carving the time out for us. We'd like to just make the best use of your time and jump right in, but maybe you could just start and tell us about kind of some of the work you're doing with Clean Grid and where your focus is currently.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. We've kind of shuffled things around a little bit. So my primary focus really is Wisconsin and Michigan right now. We have a good coalition built up in North Dakota to manage the legislative session. Madeline Samarillo, who's on our team, is taking the lead in Minnesota, and then I continue to do the regulatory work there. Very exciting in Minnesota right now. We're in the process of moving a 100% carbon-free standard bill by 2040, so that's very exciting. We passed the first House committee this week, and then next week we'll be moving on to the Senate committee. So things are moving quickly, so that's very exciting. So those are kind of the primary things we're working on to get pulled in a lot of directions. It's hard to put together a schedule that functions when you get pulled with the legislative session, because when legislators want things, they want them right now. You have to react to things. So it's just try to get through the end of May and catch our breath.
Well, we're happy to have your attention in Wisconsin as well. I know the legislative landscape here may be a little more stalemate or less opportunity than Minnesota, but it all leads somewhere, right? You got to start from somewhere. You got to crawl before you can walk, as they say. So maybe we'll jump right into some of the context for the conversation. As you're well aware, if we are going to integrate more solar and wind in the U.S. electricity system, we need more transmission lines, and our transmission lines are a bit old and somewhat outdated. 70% of them were built over 25 years ago. So could you speak on our current grid and explain what sorts of problems we're currently facing with solar and wind facility integration?
Yeah, I mean, those statistics you just brought up there is very telling. The system, we'll just talk about kind of the MISO Midwest system just to keep things simple. But, the grid was really built, it was built by the utilities. It was built on, all these centralized baseload generators. And the system wasn't really designed for the integration of, distributed resources like wind and solar, where you're going to put them, in very rural areas. MISO did a very good job of integrating batch of transmission lines, over a decade ago, the CapEx 2020 lines. All of those have been built and are in service except for Cardinal Hickory Creek, which is still under litigation. But that has been able to integrate many gigawatts of more renewable energy onto the system. If you look at the MISO grid in its totality, it's really only about 12, 13, 14% of the capacity in MISO is renewable energy resources. One of the challenges we're seeing, especially in MISO Zone 1, which is North Dakota, South Dakota, parts of Iowa, the transmission availability is basically full. It's very hard to get hooked up to the grid, so we're kind of in this, we had this big build out of renewables across these various states, significant build out, but we're kind of starting to hit a brick wall here. Unless you retire baseload generators and use those existing interconnects or do creative things like interconnecting wind and solar by utilizing, sharing an interconnect with, say, a peaking plant that runs only 7 or 10% of the time. So there are some things that are going to help in the short term, allow us to bring more renewables on, but ultimately the next batch of transmission lines is going to be key to moving the ball forward.
Let's talk about that a little bit. How do transmission lines support the development of, say, solar and wind facilities?
MISO's most recent Tranche 1 package that they just passed earlier this last year, it's the largest transmission investment in the history of the United States. It's over $10 billion. It's 18 lines across the MISO North region, and it's going to help facilitate upwards of 53 gigawatts of renewable energy resources in its totality. The challenge is that these lines take a long time, 6 years, maybe 10 years. I think earliest people are hoping is that maybe some of these lines could be online by 2030. And when you're thinking about climate goals and all these other things, it's really everybody's ready to go with renewable resources. The prices have fallen, battery storage has fallen, the utilities are moving this direction, carbon-free standards are getting passed in the various states. But until we can get more transmission lines built, we're kind of going to be very much stuck in a difficult situation.
Yeah, we've been hearing, for the past, 5 or 6 years about the challenges in the MISO interconnection queue and some of the ways that those costs are kind of passed on to facility developers. Do you want to speak to the urgency of transmission investments? This idea that MISO has advanced a bunch of projects, but we have 6 years before those come online. So what is the state of play today?
Those obviously are very robust, they're going to be very important, but there's going to be other opportunities. You're going to have, Xcel Energy, who's you're very familiar with. They're very active up here in Minnesota, Wisconsin, North, South Dakota. They have a very aggressive integrated resource plan that got approved late last year. They're going to be coal-free by 2030. That's going to free up a ton of opportunity for renewables to replace that capacity that they're losing. You have the L&S King plant on the banks of the St. Croix River in Bayport that'll help facilitate over 650 megawatts of solar in western Wisconsin where I live. And then Sherburne County Generating Center, which is one of the largest coal plants in the upper Midwest, will be coal-free by 2028. And they're going to build a very large solar project right there, Sherco Solar, on site to help utilize part of that existing interconnect. And then they're being very creative in that they want to build some generation tie lines or a big extension cord down to southwestern Minnesota and fill it all up with wind and solar. So in the short term, I think there's some opportunities. And then maybe to take it further, we have Grid North Partners, which is kind of the next generation of CapEx 2020. It's a group of about 10 utilities here in the upper Midwest that built those CapEx lines. They continue to coordinate and communicate and see what other opportunities they have within their structure to build more transmission lines kind of outside of the MISO Tranche 1 process. And maybe finally, Nick, one of the challenges, great that MISO was able to come to an agreement on these lines, because when it comes to transmission lines, the two biggest things is where do you put them and who pays for them? And right now, through the generator interconnection process, independent power producers, when they get into the MISO process to try to interconnect, say, 100 megawatt solar or 250 50 megawatt wind project, the cost allocation for system upgrades makes the project's cost prohibitive. That money would have to be, those upgrades would have to be paid for by the developer. And of course, you'd have to bake that into the sale of your project or your power purchase agreement, and it makes them cost prohibitive. So those projects end up getting stalled out. They try to get back into the MISO queue process to see if they can get a better position.
In the near term, you see kind of a lot of repowering work as legacy fossil closes, some opportunities for, like you said, some more creative interconnections. What role do you see for energy storage? Is energy storage playing a role in kind of alleviating in the near term some transmission issues?
Storage is fast approaching. There's not a whole lot up here in the upper Midwest. I know Minnesota has some smaller projects. It gets challenging with MISO, the way they value them in the system. And, we have kind of the 4-hour battery storage projects. And me working in Minnesota, which has an integrated resource planning process, very robust, storage is just starting to show up in kind of the modeling as a good least cost resource. I think you're also seeing various states that are pushing, more aggressive maybe procurement targets or storage mandates. That makes it a little bit easier in a state that doesn't have resource planning, because when you have resource planning, it can kind of make things challenging. But yes, I think storage is going to be a big piece of that puzzle. It's just so new up here that it's unclear to me how big of an impact it's going to have and how soon, those types of facilities can get hooked up to the grid and kind of alleviate some of those congestion points.
Yeah, to put a little finer point on that, in Minnesota, you referenced integrated resource planning, which you're really future forecasting, and it's like, a process which are data from the utilities and other stakeholders, figuring out pricing, demand forecasting, generation forecasting. And Minnesota also has this kind of like all resource bidding that lets things like storage play into kind of bidding for new capacity additions. So to put a finer point on it, you're actually seeing in that process that storage is seeming more and more promising as a kind of a grid asset.
I do, yes. And, if you talk to the big utilities right now in Minnesota about storage, they would say, it's not quite there, it's getting there. Trust me, when it's a good value for our customers and for our system, we will be doing lots of it. Of course, that's the utilities. You always got to push them a little bit, but I'm confident that storage will be another big aspect of the way our grid functions. We always talk about reliability and price, is the most important pieces. And I think, transmission is a big key to that, but storage is also going to be a big key to ensuring that we're able to keep the lights on and keeping the prices down.
Maybe we can back up a little bit, and can you walk us through kind of like, you say 6 years for a transmission project to really come to fruition. Can you kind of walk through how these projects are proposed, who owns them, what type of approvals they need to go through? Like, what are the steps for them to kind of like really come online?
I'm no regulatory expert on transmission lines, and nor am I a lawyer, but they're very complex and controversial projects. I think about all the work I've done in wind and solar siting projects, and they can be controversial at the local level for various reasons, but ultimately usually are able to find the common ground and move forward in 18 months. Transmission lines are a lot different. You're talking about hundreds of miles in length, going right through the middle of people's property. And, probably the most controversial thing about transmission lines is that, they're primarily built, owned, and operated by investor-owned utilities or merchant transmission owners. And you have, questions about right of first refusal. Some states allows the utilities to kind of say, we're gonna build these things, we're not gonna bid them out. Other states have open bidding. I don't have a lot of experience as to how successful open bidding in a state that doesn't have a right of first refusal for utilities, but it is also a big issue. The primary thing is that utilities have eminent domain authority, and probably this is most prominent in transmission line cases. So things get very controversial. So first off, a utility's got to decide, okay, we have point A and point B as to where this line's going to go. And then they have to very carefully think about how they want to route that line. They have to do all kinds of notification to local units of governments, to landowners. They have to have public meetings in all these different cities and townships to educate people on what could potentially be on the table. And so, like, let's say ultimately they get to a point where they're feeling pretty comfortable about generally what their preferred route of this transmission line is going to be. They have to go to the commissions, the various commissions. They have to file, in Minnesota, they have to file a certificate of need, and then they would file their route permit. And then that's when things can get very challenging. People want to intervene. This is going through my property. This is going through my township. I don't want it. And so there's all kinds of pieces that have to get worked through. And then you have interveners, just like you would in a siting docket. You might have labor groups or environmental groups, large industrial customers that are concerned about rates and all these other things. And this process can take a very long time. It can, like I say, in a perfect scenario, probably 6 years. I would use the Cardinal Hickory Creek transmission line as the original CapEx line in 2011, and we're basically fighting over a 2-mile stretch across the Mississippi River, and it's been in litigation for all this time, and it's still not done. And so I think there's concern that if we get bogged down in the same scenario with all these other transmission lines, it could take a really long time.
I would say, and I'm very curious on your perspective here, that it seemed kind of a more dire situation just a few years ago, both kind of like the interconnection queue and, like you said, some of these example projects that have really faced a significant amount of opposition delay. But the passage of the CHIPS Act, Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and Inflation Reduction Act put together a grander vision of wind and solar development and supported some transmission development. Can you talk about how you see that impacting industry and the development process? What are some of the key provisions, and what do you think we can expect from that?
It's pretty impressive what the federal government has done in such a short amount of time. I would say that the IRA bill is probably the most significant federal policy around energy that we've seen in a very long time, and probably won't see something of that magnitude in a very long time. As you mentioned, that provides all kinds of opportunities for wind and solar and battery storage, nuclear, carbon capture, a little bit of everything. And having that certainty for 10 years is going to be very helpful. I would say on the infrastructure bill, from my perspective, and I think other people kind of in the large scale renewable energy development industry, is that bill falls a little bit short on transmission. There really isn't anything in there that's going to assist in kind of the bulk transmission line build out. Most of the money that's kind of embedded within that bill is going to be utilized for rural co-ops and others that are looking for like grid hardening initiatives, very specific transmission upgrades, just harden the grid. And from a large bulk transmission perspective, it fell short. That being said, we've never really felt that we needed federal government financial help to build these things. It's really through the MISO process with the incumbent utilities, and as I mentioned, figuring out what you want to build, where you want to build it, and then who's going to pay for it. And the who's going to pay for it part is always the most challenging. And then finally, I would say the reason why we feel good about that is, MISO goes through a very complex value process, and they don't propose lines unless they show, a nice return on investment. And this tranche one set of lines will have a significant benefit to cost ratio, just as the 2011 MISO MVP lines did.
Yeah, maybe we could talk a little bit about that. What are the key factors that raise costs of these transmission lines? I think you might have identified a few already. They're kind of like people costs, really. And how do we overcome them? I guess it seems to me, maybe to start, is that we need transmission to enable a lot of these large-scale resources that are incentivized through the Inflation Reduction Act, and if we want to decarbonize, that is kind of the context here. So taking that to be true, one, I guess, how big of a limitation are the transmission lines in the development of robust solar and wind resource, and what contributes to their cost, and how can we address that?
You have upfront capital costs, that we're going to have to pay over, a certain period of time. But the ultimate goal and the vision is that coal plants are losing hundreds of millions of dollars a year. That North Dakota plant that GRE sold, I think they were losing $140 million a year in sunk costs. And so the advantage is that when you build these new transmission lines, you're replacing them with resources that have zero fuel cost, and that's forever. So you don't have this variation of fuel costs like you do with gas prices now, or fluctuations in coal prices. People look at that and say, well, this stuff is expensive, but if you listen to the experts, MISO, some of the utilities will say, being able to integrate all the renewables that we currently have been able to do is save their ratepayers, incredible amounts of money. And, it's hard to quantify those things, but we know that solar and wind are the least cost resources. Batteries are getting close. I think solar is probably on par with gas, but then you got to think about, the environmental costs. Those are hard to bake in too. Greenhouse gases, it's not good for the environment. It's not good for the planet. And I think the United States doesn't value the cost of environmental pollution through these things like some other countries do. All the utilities are hedging, and they know that the cost to operate these plants going forward is going to be a liability for them. And so that's why you're seeing this completely driven by economics and the environmental aspects too to move these things forward.
You can't predict the future, but what we know is that the absolutely unprecedented cost declines in solar are here and will continue, and some probably not as steep as we've seen previously, but when the fuel source is free, you just have your upfront hardware investment. And Iowa has successfully integrated, any given day, 70% of their electricity comes from wind, and they have some of the lowest electricity rates in the Midwest. So we know that, some of these things have, they're based in current reality. With the transmission line, how much are you seeing, say, in MISO or at Public Service Commission, or even kind of in this legislative conversation, how much are you seeing discussion of non-transmission alternatives, basically kind of like load destruction in the distribution system? What role does that play kind of in the transmission planning process?
This is not an and or situation. This is kind of I don't want to use the term all of the above, but everything is going to be a contributing factor, whether it's a demand side management, you're going to have, distributed side resources. For example, we have, Minnesota has the Community Solar Garden program, but that's capped at 1 megawatt, so you kind of have projects scattered about. We have federal PURPO that provides for self-generation. So you have the very large refinery just south of the Twin Cities, one of the biggest refineries. They're going to move forward and build their own solar plant. I'm not sure exactly where it's at, but it's a very large 50 megawatt solar plant to help offset their utility costs. And then you have very innovative companies that are looking to do 10 to 15 to 20 megawatt size solar projects on the distribution side. And all that is helpful in this kind of non-wires alternative scenario. Can't all be done by utility scale solar. I think the bulk of it probably will, because when you're talking about price and efficiency and all these things, that's going to be an important piece. So I think there's a lot of tools, there's a lot of resources and creative ways that you can help balance all of this out beyond just the transmission side of things.
I think it's important what you just said, this kind of like we need it all, because what we haven't actually talked about, and I'm curious to see how this has been influencing the conversations that you're in, is just through electrification, just the growth in electric usage that, for over a decade now, we've been looking at flat to decreasing electricity demand. And now with electrification, it's like DOE Solar Future study says, you're going to have to increase transmission capacity by 30% just for all electric vehicles and electrification of buildings. So it must be putting some pressure on this conversation. I'm wondering what type of conversations you see out there, or, is this seen as like motivation, or is it really just a threat?
I think people are still just trying to get their hands wrapped around what all this means. Obviously, I've seen some numbers on various states of how much, if you had 3 or 4 different scenarios of electrification in the state, whether it's electric vehicles or buildings or all these other things, what the increase in electricity used and demand is going to be. And I think it's going to take a collective of everybody to try to figure it out. I think of my years working on transportation policy. Electric vehicles were never in the discussion, and now it's like there's this crossover between transportation and energy and utility law and utilities, and this question about how can electric vehicles help balance the grid, with charging at different times, or drawing from charging vehicles at certain times to help balance the grid out. So there's a lot of integration that's going to have to occur here. And then this question about how do we meet the demand? How do we meet the demand 24 hours a day? Currently we have this general kind of duck curve, that we see for demand throughout the day, and regional transmission operators are, can follow it very well. They can determine what demand is going to be. And as we electrify the economy in many different aspects, that's going to change. And it's going to be more challenging for utilities and the regional transmission operators and others to balance that grid. And it's going to be a collective effort with people from all different backgrounds to try to achieve that goal.
In that context, I see a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot, but some very vocal pushback still on like the intermittency and variability of like clean energy assets to meet this like growing demand when you don't know what the load's going to be. You want to address some of that? Is that a problem, and how will it be addressed?
It's a very challenging situation we're in. I mean, we're doing okay right now. I mean, if you look at the Southwest Power Pool, which is to just the west of us, equivalent of MISO, granted they have a much smaller load than MISO does, but they have so much wind in their system that on an average day, they can be anywhere from 40 to 65% of all the electricity being generated and consumed in the Southwest Power Pool is coming from wind. So SPP has shown that you can integrate a ton of renewables and keep the system running and functioning properly. And I'll just use MISO as an example. Yes, it's a challenge. I mean, just to get to 30% MISO wide, you start running into all kinds of engineering challenges. You have, to be able to model every hour of every day throughout the year and try to make a determination of what your maximum demand is going to be, whether it's a hot day in the summer or a really cold day in the middle of the winter. You have to make sure that you have the resources available to cover those times of the year, even if it's for 1 hour or 2 days or a week. That's a challenge, trying to figure out, you don't want to overbuild the system. You want to make sure that you're utilizing all your resources properly. And then if you add on top that we want to move to a carbon-free electricity, just electricity alone, carbon-free system, what does that system looks like when you have variable resources or non-dispatchable resources is the term they use. Are batteries the canary to help do that? Is it nuclear power? I mean, nuclear is a carbon-free resource. Xcel Energy, they operate 2 nuclear facilities in Minnesota, treats them as a carbon-free resource. Once again, it's also a baseload dispatchable resource. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges. They're not overcomable. They are engineering challenges that can be achieved. And then I would say the secondary piece of that is in the various state legislatures that I work in, we're starting to see a very robust discussion about reliability and the fact that renewable resources are non-dispatchable. And as we've seen things that happen in Texas and California, even in parts of MISO from winter last year, and people that are very sophisticated, legislators that can read news stories about capacity markets getting very short in MISO. This triggers them in the various states to say, well, I need to do something. I'm not going to let my constituents go dark, so I'm going to do something. So then you get into this public policy debate that what should each individual state do around reliability. So you have all kinds of bills that emerge in these various state legislatures that are very challenging for us to try to work with, because we're operating in a regional system with MISO. Everybody opts into MISO. And if each individual state said, well, we're just going to go off and do what we want, that makes things very complicated from a legislative and regulatory perspective, but it also makes it very difficult from a planning perspective from the regional grid.
Yeah, that seems like a challenge that's not going anywhere soon. You do have this ship with many captains approach. And I think that's one of the reasons we were excited to talk with you, is because you are working in multiple states and you're seeing the different approaches and the different tools that states have to work with, because not all states are Minnesota, right? Not all states have IRP and like all resource bidding and pretty much a legislature that's really interested in tackling this full force. Kind of want to bring it back to the local level a bit here, because I think, if you look at levels of opposition, well, let's frame the conversation here. We're really looking at this kind of rural renewable energy deployment scenario where we're just at the beginning of this wave, where it's just starting. And this includes solar and wind and transmission siting. And we're basically going from this one centralized power plant to many thousands of acres of assets. And what we know is that this provides a tremendous local tax benefit to local jurisdictions and, of course, jobs. But what we see is pretty significant opposition. Not only, I mean, I would say level of opposition to solar is probably less than wind, which is less than transmission, and we need all of them. So I guess from your perspective, how are we going to address these issues? What do we need to do at the local level to help communities understand the benefits of some of these things and minimize the risks?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I'm glad that you brought that up because, my five years working with Clean Grid, it can be pretty easy to, get stuck working on state public policy, roaming the halls of state legislatures, talking with decision makers and such. But the reality is if you can't get projects built locally in these rural communities, you can't do anything. Over my time, I've tried to do as much as I can, and I need to do more, is to try to get out in the field, meet and talk with local county officials, township officials, just to understand, their wants and needs. And some of the things that I've seen over the years is that the tax revenue base is a really big piece. I mean, this is significant income for very rural communities that don't have a lot of money for schools and roads, first responders and such. And these projects have put significant amount of resources into these communities, long-term resources where they're able to lower property tax and do some of these other things. And you can go to certain communities in southwestern Minnesota where I've spent a lot of time, where there's a large wind build out. And boy, some of these very small towns are incredibly vibrant and clean and have great roads and all these things. And it's because of the revenue that comes from the wind industry. Now, that being said, that is not the panacea. We're starting to see communities across Iowa, Minnesota, primarily where we have just this real high concentration of wind in kind of that Buffalo Ridge area, where they're coming up and they're saying, we've done enough. Can you take these projects someplace else? The saturation level is too high. We don't want any more of this stuff. We're okay with what we have, but we don't want more of it. So one of the challenges that we're facing is a density issue where you're going to be building more stuff closer together in these really good areas. And then two, we're going to be building in areas that are going to be closer to population centers, maybe closer to sensitive environmental areas. So you pick all the low-hanging fruit and find all the really good spots that have great interconnection and all these things. But once those are gone, then you got to start going in more challenging places, and you're going to see more local opposition because I haven't seen this before. You're not going to build a wind plant, in the suburbs, on the edge of the suburbs of Madison. I mean, it's just not going to happen because you don't have the land and the room and all that stuff. So it's going to be very important for utilities, stakeholders, and others to get in and talk to these locals and figure out what their wants and needs are. You can't just come in and say, you guys are going to get all this revenue, take it. This gets very complicated, Nick, for a variety of reasons. A lot of these rural communities, as we know, they're much more conservative than you're going to find in the urban core cities where the policies are made. And when you talk to some of these folks, they say, you guys want this stuff. Why do we have to be the ones that host it? And so you get into kind of a difficult kind of dynamic there. And it takes good quality people that can educate and talk across kind of political spectrums to find those pieces that make people comfortable about these things. I would say at Clean Grid Alliance, it was right around when I was starting, we started seeing a lot of these local opposition groups starting to pop up across the Midwest, becoming more sophisticated, social media, all these other things. And we got a grant from, I believe it was the McKnight Foundation, to kind of figure out a way to do more work locally to help combat, these local opposition groups. It's one thing if individual landowners have concerns, you address those, but when you have these groups that their only goal is to kill wind and solar projects across the region. And so you fast forward and we've built this program into what's now called the Land and Liberty Coalition, and we are fiscal agents. And it's basically taking conservative voiced individuals and going and putting this program together, and they go into these local communities and try to connect with the locals from a conservative perspective. It's about private property rights, it's about revenue, it's about speaking about the environment in different ways. And it's those types of pieces that I think are all necessary along with developers and utilities and everybody. They need to get in early and often and build those relationships with locals. If we really think that we're going to be able to do this, that is the most important piece.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, is that there's this social investment that's needed. And we kind of see that all across land use now, right? It's kind of this status quo bias. People are a bit hesitant, or maybe they have some built-in bias because of their political affiliation. And the only way around that is to be there and to network, to talk about the benefits, to dispel myths. And so it's really good to hear you talking about that level of work. And it's kind of something that obviously we hope that will expand, because we shouldn't be surprised at this point when there is opposition, right? Where there's enough evidence out there to show that a lot of this it's a human and social construct that we're dealing with. So I guess in that context, we've talked a bit about state legislation, we've talked about the MISO plans, we've talked a little about wholesale markets. From your desk, what do you see as kind of like the biggest policy priorities now? What are some of the hurdles? What should we really be focusing on to kind of like take the fullest advantage of the infrastructure bill and IRA energy provisions?
I mean, obviously getting some transmission built is key. I mean, we're seeing good development in states like Wisconsin and Illinois, states in kind of the eastern side of MISO, because there's capacity availability there. Things are very quiet in North Dakota, South Dakota. Minnesota's got a few projects. The biggest thing that I can do outside of kind of the structure of the way MISO functions is to ensure that each individual states have good, predictable siting policies to allow for certainty to move projects forward. That is the biggest challenge for us at Clean Grid right now. Each state is very different. Some states, it's very top heavy, where the state commission permits everything and the locals can talk and they can provide comments, but they don't have any sort of local jurisdictional say over these projects other than, road agreements and, some of these other things. And then you have states on the other end, like the state of Michigan, where everything is permitted at the township level. And you don't have the same kind of regulatory certainty that you would if you had a state body that's permitting things. And so you have a situation where, let's say you're trying to build a wind farm in the state of Michigan. This is going to cross 4 or 5 townships. All the townships look at this differently. They may want to set different zoning regulations, different noise standards, different shadow flicker standards. And they don't even have, in some cases, they wouldn't even have the expertise to put these things together. And so there's a very much a development uncertainty in the state of Michigan, and it's really hard and it's very expensive to try to get a project moved forward there. And if there's one thing that large-scale renewable energy development doesn't like, it's uncertainty. You think of all the moving pieces of land control, a favorable regulatory environment to get permits, interconnection points with transmission lines, getting through the MISO interconnection process, finding an off-taker, whether it's a power purchase agreement or a build-own transfer. I mean, there's so much that goes into it. My goal, at least in the states that I work in, I have some that work very, very well. We have states like Michigan that we need to have some discussions about how can we find that common ground with local units of government, with the state legislature, and find something that provides more certainty. Because as Michigan is an example, I mean, the utilities, they want a whole bunch of renewables coming out of their integrated resource plans. The governor talks about, these big climate change initiatives, but if you literally can't get projects built in the ground, it begs the question, like, who's in charge of energy policy in the state of Michigan? And if you ask the legislators, they'd say, well, we are. We have the Energy Committee, we have the Public Service Commission, and the reality is that all the cards are held at the local level. And if you physically can't get through that process, you can't do anything. The siting structure in the various states is the biggest thing that we can do, set ourselves up for when these transmission lines come, that we have a process in place that provides the robust public participation and all these things, a regulatory path to move forward if we're truly going to decarbonize. And I'll say, there's many ways that you can do it. You can take authority away from locals. You can give authority to locals. And we see a little bit of that in every state. Like in the state of Wisconsin, we have a state process. But now you're saying, well, we need to have a local process too. In Iowa, we have a local process. And now some of the locals are making it more difficult. And they're like, well, maybe we need a state process. So it's a constant moving target, Nick, and there's no perfect scenario. And those are the biggest, most complex policy issues that we work on.
Do you have an example in the U.S. or even in the Midwest of a state that you think strikes the right balance? Because, as you said, you have to have local participation if you want local support to some degree, right? You can't just leave the locals out hanging to dry, because that increases opposition and may swing the pendulum the other way if you're not careful. And like you said, in Michigan, it's really difficult to cite a project when you have 6 different authorities having jurisdiction that all have different rules. So what state do you think really strikes the right balance? Do you have a model that you all pursue?
I would say, generally speaking, I think the best system is a state-run process that has the expertise to cite these things. I would say that Minnesota is very functional. The Public Utilities Commission is very thorough. They have very good expertise. They also have the Department of Commerce division, which is unique to Minnesota alone, where they do all kinds of environmental review. They do sure that these projects are in the ratepayer interest. And they have a very robust public participation process so that all folks can come in and intervene. In all of my time, I've only seen one project where it was very, very contentious, and that was Freeborn Wind. The locals really didn't want it, and they had a large contingency at the hearings at the Public Utilities Commission. And I also say that while the locals generally don't have control over these projects, the commission and staff and the Department of Commerce, they very, very much listen to what the local units of government have to say. And if the local units of government have a serious, real grievance, the commission will tell the applicants, you guys need to go figure this out or we're not moving this thing forward. Minnesota works. I've never seen a situation where the state has crammed local units of government. I would say that Wisconsin functions very well. They have a thoughtful commission. They have good staff. We have wind siting policies and statute. We don't have solar siting policies and statute, but they've done a very good job of just building the record and working through it, and I think it's been very successful. I think you have hybrid states like North Dakota where the locals have a certain level of say in how they oversee these projects. It's been traditionally successful, but now we're seeing more opposition at the local level to start writing very creative zoning regulations that make it very difficult to develop projects. So it can come in a variety of different ways. South Dakota works very well. I mean, you can get a project put into the commission once complete. You can get that permit typically in under 9 months. And then I would say some states have certificate of need requirements like Minnesota, which I think is unnecessary for an independent power producer, but that's probably for a different discussion. It can take a year and a half, even longer, depending if the workload over at the commission is busy. So there's a bunch of different ways to kind of, value the process and how well it works. But certainty is the most important piece. Yeah, would we like them to be a little bit shorter in some cases, for time frames? Yes. But I think it's fair to make sure that we've allowed everybody to intervene to make sure that once the permit gets approved, that everybody's in a good place. And I would say that Wisconsin and Minnesota, they do a pretty good job, and South Dakota does a pretty good job too.
We appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us. It sounds like we have our work cut out for us. There's a lot of education to do, but a tremendous amount of opportunity for infrastructure development in rural areas, tax revenue increases, jobs, clean electrification, but you're jumping through the hoops. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us about kind of what you expect or parting positive words? I know you sometimes can't see the forest for the trees because you're always roaming the halls of state capitals, but how do you feel? Do you feel positive?
I would say, Nick, I feel pretty good. I would say, being a conservative Republican working on these things, it's fun to build those relationships. It's fun to see conservative Republicans embracing this kind of transition. And while there's going to be all kinds of challenges, this can't be just a one political party driving the ship here. Everybody needs to get on board and work together. And, either we are determined to do this or we slide back into something else. And I'm very confident that the future looks good. And when I retire from this industry, it'll be fun to see how far we've come with technology around renewable energy resources and all these things. So I do feel good. But it's hard work, and it's a lot of political capital, it's a lot of emotional capital. But as I always say, the most important thing is relationships, and everybody needs to work together, build those strong relationships, build that trust. And if you can do that, you can get anything done.
Well, thanks. That seems like a great place to wrap it up is the need for coalition building. Peter, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it, and it's been fun talking to you, and we hope to continue the conversation.
Thanks, Nick. I appreciate it as well.
Thanks to the Community Foundation of Central Wisconsin, hundreds of students from around the Midwest will be able to attend the 2023 Energy Fair at no cost. The Community Foundation gives everyone the opportunity to make significant and lasting gifts to their community. Founded in 1982, the foundation is celebrating 40 years in 2023. To learn more and support, visit cfcwi.org.
The Rise Up Podcast, Season 4, Episode 5, Rural Renewable Energy and Transmission Projects. Special thanks to our guest, Peter Mavis, hosted by Nick Hyla and produced by Kyle Galloway, made possible with support from the Sally Mead Hands Foundation.